Hello, humanoids. Boy, can you believe it? This is our second and last lecture in, what is it? The module on policy for science. And we only have a couple of lectures after this. So, my goodness, we're really getting there. This one, I really wanted to be designed for some fun to stimulate you, get you thinking about things that are kind of controversial, interesting to think about, and I think important. So we've titled this one Forbidden Knowledge. Now I've given you the Leon Cass reading uh, to also do, and I've got a note on that coming up. Of course, we started with the picture of the forbidden fruit, right? The knowledge of good and evil. It's deeply ingrained in Western culture that knowledge is a good thing. We've got Socrates here, we've got Kant. And so when we talk about forbidding knowledge or forbidden knowledge, we are getting at some really fundamental ethical commitments that we've got in our culture and around science. You should also be thinking, I guess before I get to this one, about related things like censorship and our commitments to freedom of speech. When, if ever, is censorship a good thing? It's a kind of related topic. Quote of the day, Akbar's quote of the day. It's not possible to be a scientist unless you believe the knowledge of the world and the power which this gives is a thing which is of intrinsic value to humanity, and that you are using it to help in the spread of knowledge, are willing to take the consequences. That's Robert Oppenheimer, of course, widely known as the father of the atomic bomb. After seeing the first atomic explosion, he said that in some crude sense, physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge they cannot lose. So deep fundamental things going on here that scientists have been wrestling with. When, if ever, should we seek to not know something? I think maybe the most profound ethics and science question we can address. Okay, today I've got a lot of slides. I'll try to go through them quickly because, again, my goal is really just to kind of provoke thinking more than to lay out as something systematic that you need to kind of memorize. We'll start with one slide on Cass, and then the rest is going to be a little bit of review, this part two on, but twisting what we've already done to make the point that we largely think of knowledge as this unmitigated good, like the Oppenheimer quote, it's intrinsically valuable. And then I'm going to conclude with a bunch of slides in these four categories, four reasons that we might to forbid knowledge, forbid science. Okay, the note about Cass first, Leon Cass, who is he? A physician and also a bioethicist, a scholar of the humanities. He's in many ways a conservative voice, I think a very thoughtful one. He was the head of the President's Council on Bioethics under George W. Bush, and I just happened to write my first book on that Leon Cass Bioethics Council. I just want you to note as you're reading that a few things here. So first, note his opening distinction, forbidding as something that's like foreboding or ominous or daunting, and forbidding in the sense of we're going to prohibit something. Keep both those in mind because he plays with that dynamic a bit. And he says just because something is forbidding in the first sense doesn't mean we should forbid it in the second sense necessarily, right? I also want you to note, I think one of the really good takeaways from this is this taxonomy of three questions. If you think about forbidding a line of scientific research, there's really three kinds of questions you can ask about that. Is that a good thing or a desirable thing to do? Is it even possible, logistically, practically possible to do it? And is it wise? As in, if you were to do it, would it have unintended consequences, say, or even foreseeable consequences that are worse than what you could get by allowing the research to go forward? So I think that's a good taxonomy for thinking. And then I think this is my last one, to just think about as you're reading the Cass, super important foundational point about the distinction between science and technology. This is something I opened the course with when I said, look, a course on ethics and science has to be about ethics and technoscience. Cass largely agrees with me on that one. He doesn't really think there's an operative boundary between science and technology, at least not always, and not always in a practical sense, where you could allow the science to continue but somehow prohibit the technological applications of the science. Although he's open to that, and he thinks when you can, if you have to prohibit something, better to prohibit the application than the actual pursuit of knowledge, right? Okay. Big questions that we're asking. Is knowledge an unqualified good? Are there things we should not know? If so, what kinds of things and why? So again, it's not enough to avoid fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism and follow the rules when it comes to research with human subjects. We've got these bigger questions to think through. Okay. Remember Werner von Braun? Okay, this is my part 2 of our lecture today. A little bit of review. You remember this line, once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Werner von Braun. That's a song by Tom Lehrer. And we talked about going from doing things right, so that they keep the trains running, to doing the right things. That is, make sure the trains are going in the right direction for the right purpose. And this opening up a broader set of ethical questions. And this question about forbidding science can be seen in this broader set that we've kind of opened up already in this class. And then I list a bunch of questions here, some of which Cass takes up in his article. For example, wouldn't somebody else do it anyway? So if Werner von Braun said, I'm going to listen to my conscience and I shouldn't be developing rockets that are intended for use against civilians, say, well, wouldn't they just slot in the next rocket scientist, for example? And we've asked these questions about responsibility. So this question about forbidding science, I want to say to you, is really just an extension of what we've already sort of opened up, this can of worms in this class. We've also talked about last time, this linear model, that knowledge is an unmitigated good, that if you put money into basic science and you get this reservoir of knowledge, people can pull from it to get applied science applications, and that will lead to good things. And this we got out of Vannevar Bush, right? The idea is that what's good for science is good for society. More knowledge is always better, right? So again, we've already sort of entered into this territory. That's exactly what we just said. Scientific progress automatically leads to social progress. We saw this note from Vannevar Bush. So again, a little bit of review here. But this is another way of saying science is an unmitigated good, right? We would never forbid it because progress comes from knowledge, right? And if it's good science as judged by scientists, it's good for society. And the scientist's responsibility to end with the production of knowledge. Okay, so we've talked about all that before. We're just setting it up now to think about forbidding knowledge. This conversation has a long history. Francis Bacon, who was writing in the 17th century, had already conceived of, and this not something I gave you to read, but you can Google and find the whole text of the New Atlantis. This is a foundational modern philosophical text. And it's kind of a utopia. It's about these sailors who go and they visit this island, and they discover this island is perfect. Everybody lives long, happy, healthy lives. And they discover why it's such a great place to live is they have this, what we would call now, R&D enterprise, a scientific institution at the heart of it that develops all of these wonderful innovations by coming up with new knowledge about how to control nature to make human life better. The head of that scientific R&D institution says this, that we decide in advance which of the inventions we're going to publish and which ones we're going to keep secret. Okay, so here's that valve between, well, an elite class of scientists could know something, they could know everything, but they will decide what of that knowledge they're going to share with society and allow for applications of it. As Cass notes in his article, note if you're carefully reading it, Cass references Francis Bacon in the New Atlantis, and he says, this is not the way we do it now. We in a democracy don't have the elites making these sort of gatekeeping decisions for us. Okay, so yes, in other words, Francis Bacon, is presuming this valve between knowledge and society, or between science and technology. And I would say to you, that valve doesn't exist. And that's what Cass is saying in his article too, right? Now, Cass doesn't mention this case study, but think about deepfakes. You may have heard about this. The idea that you can create a video that, for even experts maybe, it's impossible to tell whether that really happened or not. You've seen this in the movies, for example, Carrie Fisher in Star Wars being resurrected from the dead to play a new role in some of the later movies. Can you have the knowledge of how to do that and somehow keep that knowledge secret and not have it be applied in society if you decide it was too dangerous because somebody might make a deep fake video, say, of a world leader declaring war on another country? I don't know, right? This is what Cass is trying to think about, what you should be thinking about. If something is so dangerous in its applications, should we even go down the road pursuing knowledge about it? Again, I'm just trying to spark some thinking for you. Okay, third part of the lecture here. 4 reasons you might think about relinquishing or forbidding, in the second sense of that word, to prohibit the pursuit of knowledge. Number 4, I'm going to spend most time on because that's Cass's domain. Number 1, paralysis. Knowledge kills action. Number 2, the mode of acquisition. The way you get the knowledge is just wrong. 3, physical harm or risks. And then 4, these other kinds of harms. That's where Cass wants to try to develop a richer moral vocabulary than what we typically have. Because look, we see number 3 pretty easily as moderns. But harms to tradition, to character, to community, to the meaning of being human, to human nature, to the lived experience of the human condition, these are harder for us to grasp, but they're very much still at stake. That's what Cass's point is. And so our ethical language at the bottom is really good at risks and rights. So it's good at articulating those first 3 kinds of reasons you might forbid science, but not so good at the last one. That's why I wanted you to read Cass. So the first one, knowledge kills action. Calvin and Hobbes, as they often do with philosophy, summed it up perfectly, saying the more you know, the harder it is to take decisive action. Once you become informed, you start to see complexities and shades of gray. You realize there's nothing as clear and simple as it first appears, and ultimately knowledge is paralyzed. Being a man of action, I can't afford to take that risk, and he chucks his book away. Well, you're ignorant, but at least you act on it, right? So, but there is this idea that knowledge, maybe we can have so much of it that it paralyzes us because we keep thinking, oh, well, we need to know more because actually now that I know this, I realize I don't know that, right? And let me just give you this. Maybe we should ban all climate science, not because we're climate deniers, but no, for the opposite reason, because we want immediate action. And just like in the cartoon, it's time to toss away all the science because it's just bogging us down in the complexities and nuances and ambiguities, and we just need to act. Okay, so that's one to think about. 2, the mode of acquisition. Some simple examples: reading someone else's secret diary. So maybe the knowledge in there is okay to know, but it's the way you did it without their permission, say. What about torture? Maybe the knowledge you gain would be a good thing, but if you could only get it via torture, and you make a case that torture is ethically unacceptable, well then that's a forbidden form of knowledge, right? We know this human and animal subjects research. There could be some really good knowledge to be obtained, but what if it could only be obtained by violating informed consent, say, for example? So we talked about this a bit before, ill-gotten knowledge. We know the hypothermia experiments in the concentration camp. And you remember the bit that we read in the textbook about the knowledge from those concentration camp experiments being like a bar of soap. That was a powerful image. A bar of soap made from the remains of those concentration camp prisoners, that you can't use that knowledge, right? So we've talked about this a bit before. Maybe there's some knowledge that should be forbidden simply because there's no ethical way to go about acquiring it. Okay, number 3. This one we know, I think, most intuitively comes to mind. The prospect of physical harm, of risks, right? The dual use dilemma is one of the examples of this. So that one and the same piece of scientific research has the potential for good use as well as bad use, right? And this can be foreseen or not foreseen. It can be intended or not intended. And then this raises the questions which Leon Cass spends quite a bit of time talking about. Who decides? You know, how is it that you're gonna have a decision procedure about this when you've got some knowledge that can be used for good or ill? Now, I think I have some examples here. So this piece, you can Google it and find it. I think 1998, Bill Joy, who was the founder of, I think, Sun Microsoft Systems. Check me on that. I'm not sure, but basically a tech guy, right, who certainly was no Luddite, came out with this really provocative essay called Why the Future Doesn't Need Us. And it was about genetics, nanotech, and robotics, GNR. And he said this stuff is inherently dangerous, and it's uniquely dangerous. When you get genetics, nanotech, and robotics combining with each other, you can have the self-replicating nanobots that could turn into this gray goo that could eat up the whole ecosphere on the planet, right? So you could have people in their garages making this stuff and causing a planetary apocalypse. So our technical progress, he said, is accelerating faster than our abilities to control it and think through it. So we're kind of these technical giants and moral midgets. And his conclusion is we need to relinquish the pursuit of some forms of knowledge. Why? For that number 3 reason, it's too dangerous. Some things are too dangerous to pursue, especially this intersectional research, genomics, nanotech, and robotics, he said, because you're going to get these self-replicating robots that will be out of control and will destroy everything. Now, some people said, no, we'll just have, for the gray goo, we'll have blue bots, like little police bots that will eat up the gray goo. So now every knowledge we come up with that has dangerous implications will come up with other knowledge that will counteract those dangerous implications. I think that's our kind of default way of thinking through this. These are deep questions in our culture. This is The Sorcerer's Apprentice. You might know it from the Disney version, but you should also know that this is a poem by Goethe, the great German thinker and poet. You could say that the problem with it, so this is where the sorcerer is away, his apprentice doesn't want to do his chores, so he casts a spell on the broom, and for a while the broom is doing a good job carrying the water, but then the broom gets out of control. It starts to self-replicate like the gray goo, and the sorcerer's apprentice doesn't know enough, isn't wise enough to control it, and so in a sense does not know his own limits. And it's only because at the very end, you see the text at the bottom, the sorcerer returns in the nick of time and casts a master spell to put the broom back in the closet and save the day. Maybe we're in a situation where we are like the sorcerer's apprentice, unleashing all of these new technoscientific things that are getting out of control, but maybe there's no sorcerer to come and save us, right? Here's a dual use dilemma for you. The Spanish flu. Researchers have gone up and resurrected the Spanish flu with the hopes that it could be used for good uses, right? That we could understand this virus better so that we could be better prepared for when something like it comes about. But on the other hand, they could also just have resurrected this virus, and intentionally or not, it could get released into society. There's a classic dual use dilemma. Stephen, I got a lot of stuff in this slideshow. I'll leave that one for you. Last one, kill all the mosquitoes. CRISPR technology and gene drive technology. What if we were to apply that knowledge to just eradicating entire species of mosquitoes? Well, to do it or not to do it largely is a question about what are the harms or risks for ecosystems and the creatures that depend on those ecosystems, including us. Okay, last bit of this lecture, other kinds of harm. Hard to categorize, hard to talk about. This is a quote. Yeah, let's hope that evolution, if it's unfortunately true, it does not become widely known, right? So why? Cass talks about this in his piece. This is an old quote. Do I have? I don't have who wrote it down. You'll have to Google that one, sorry. Because evolutionary science would change the way we think about ourselves. It would decenter us from God's creation. This is the thinking, right? And that would be a kind of harm to our self-conception, right? That's another kind of harm that we're getting at. knowledge does these other kinds of harms. Now, maybe you don't think of them as harms, right? Maybe you think these are good things. It undermines authority, traditional values, our self-understanding, like this case, beliefs, traditions, meaning. It can be disorienting. It can lead to moral degradation. It could lead to nihilism. If this stuff sounds what you might want to label conservative, well, it is in a way, right? And this is why Cass is talking about it, but I think he's talking about it in a very nuanced, thoughtful, provocative way. Another novel you might want to look at, Brave New World. So not 1984. Maybe our dystopia isn't Big Brother. Maybe our dystopia is more Brave New World, where we kind of amuse ourselves to death. By the way, that's another book based on Huxley's Brave New World, in a way. That it's not that Big Brother controls us, it's that we kind of willingly dehumanize ourselves by falling into a stupor at our televisions and our internet screens and taking all of these happy pills, right? So maybe these are the kinds of harms that really technoscience is presenting, not these oppressive harms and not even physical risks, but maybe dehumanizing things, because we can never get enough of what's not good for us, right? So if we give in to our desires and we get all that we desire, and it turns out it backfires and it does us great harm, moral harm, spiritual harm, right? Social harm, cultural harms. So maybe like censorship for the sake of children, maybe some knowledge is bad for us adults even, right? Um, so yeah, another way to put this, maybe we shouldn't dare to know everything. Okay, couple of examples, and we'll wrap this up. You know this guy, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, right? The Unabomber wanted to put an end to technoscientific change, industrial, uh, high industrial, modern technoscientific change. Why? Well, life was becoming trivialized, he thought. So if you look at who did he mail his bombs to, it was really to the scientists, engineers, the academics who are at the fount of that linear model, right? Doing the research that drives all the applications that he thought was causing this fourth time kinds of harms. These other kinds of harms at trivializing life, dissolving meaning, community, right? Traditional values, and also ironically eroding our freedom because we get more and more dependent on techno systems and bureaucracies that manage those systems that are faceless, and we don't understand them, so we really become radically dependent. So technology in the name of freedom, actually we become the tool of our tools, right? To use the words of Thoreau. Kaczynski in a way was a kind of radicalized, violent Thoreau. So he wanted us to reject technology, return to nature. What about the Amish? You know, Amish is a great case study in forbidding science because now there's many different kinds of Amish. But some of them, I think the old order Amish, for example, if there's any new innovation, if they want to incorporate it into their way of life, they first have a gathering, especially of their elders, to think about what are the implications of using this, and does it fit in with our way of life, right? If it doesn't, they don't adopt it. That's fascinating. It's so opposite of what general modern Western culture does, right? We're all about innovation. We think later about how it's changing us entirely. We just want that next iPhone, or we want the next goodie, right? Rousseau is another good one here. He's I'll let you read these quotes here. A kind of what would I want to say, like a contradictory modern philosopher who wants to call into question this idea of progress, that scientific knowledge and technological changes is progress. He was one of the earliest voices, way before Cass, right, in modern conservatism, to say, hold on a second, maybe we're becoming these happy slaves when it comes to science and technology, a little bit like Huxley's Brave New World. Yeah, we're all titillated and amused, but we're all kind of enslaved and totally dependent on these systems, right? Maybe we're stuck on this hedonic treadmill too. where we get more and more stuff, more and more knowledge, but it doesn't actually fundamentally make us any happier. We actually just have to keep running faster and faster to stay in the same place. Think about this. I used WeChat here, but I don't know. You pick it. You're not into Facebook probably. Twitter, I don't know. Where are you spending your time? If your parents didn't have it when they were kids, were they miserable because of that? Did they sit around thinking, I wish I had Twitter? Well, no. So what is the good of all this innovation, right? Okay, last couple points on Cass. What Cass is saying, I think what I want you to take out of that article is these other kinds of harms that he wants to get at. They're harder for us to articulate because as children of modern scientific technological culture, we tend to think of risks and rights easily. We worry about failures and disasters. You know, if something blows up like gray goo, for example. But what about the dangers of success? What if we get all of our wildest desires satisfied? Who will we be at the end of that time? What will our culture be like at the end of the day, if that's the case? Okay. I think, is this my last slide? Oh no, I've got one. Tell you what, I think I'll skip this bit on human cloning as a case study, or let me just say a word about it here. Actually, this is useful, so I won't talk too much about cloning. But Cass wrote a piece called The Wisdom of Repugnance, which is against cloning. And I think what I wanted to emphasize here is you see this bit about happy pills and steroid use. He's saying if you take the Belmont report, which we've looked at, right, which says you have to consider informed consent and risks and justice. He said, look at that with steroids in professional sports or performance-enhancing drugs. Is the problem with steroids that they're physically risky, or that people are using them against their will, or that not everybody has equal access to them? Cass's answer is no. Actually, we wouldn't think we've solved the problem if we had really safe steroids that everybody could freely use. The problem with steroids is it deforms the human excellences that are supposed to be on display in that sporting event, right? That's the other kind of harm he's talking about. Or happy pills. What if you could take a pill that makes you happy all the time, no matter what? Would we just want to make sure it's safe and freely chosen and equally accessible to everybody? Well, no, he would argue, because you shouldn't be taking happy pills that make you happy all the time, no matter what. There's a certain kind of appropriate emotional reaction you should have to your situation, right? So that's another kind of harm we might experience. Okay, going on long enough to summarize. 10 points. Let's acknowledge the growing power and scale of technoscientific impacts and how I think they compel us to think these unthinkable thoughts about whether maybe we should say enough, right? Maybe there's some things we just shouldn't do, some things we shouldn't know. It's made hard because there's no clear valve between knowledge, acquisition, and use. We've talked about that. Well, of course, knowledge is an intrinsically wonderful, valuable, good thing. But if it's so intrinsically linked to uses, and those uses are always so mixed, and many of them are bad uses, well, maybe we have to prohibit certain kinds of knowledge. Another thing that we didn't talk as much about here, but with the Werner von Braun kind of brings it out to light. There's this compartmentalization of knowledge and distribution of responsibility. You know, who actually knows how to make an iPhone? Nobody knows how to make an iPhone. People know how to do little bits and pieces of it. But nobody knows how to do the whole thing, and in that case, nobody's really responsible for the whole thing and the implications that it has. Right? There's this unavoidable uncertainty about impacts too. I mean, if we could know in advance that deep fakes, for example, 50 years down the road is going to cause World War III, well, we might prohibit them now. But we don't know. We don't know. Right? There's going to be these deep disagreements about good and bad impacts, and Cass, I think, is really important here. Because I really like to read Cass. He really makes me think. I just have some deep disagreements with him on what he thinks is important, and how he characterizes human life, and that's just true of our society. But, and I think Cass is right on this. So even though we have these disagreements, there's a kind of bias towards some issues and some kinds of moral language, like risks and rights. and away from other issues that he tries so hard to articulate for us about, for example, human dignity, or about the excellence of sports and why performance enhancing drugs are bad, even if they're safe, right? And there's always going to be mixed impacts. Deep fakes, yeah, they might cause World War III. I don't know, but they might also do all these other good things, right? We mentioned the hedonic treadmill. That maybe knowledge is intrinsically good, but maybe there's just like real diminishing returns on it. The latest innovations just kind of crank up the same treadmill where we want that now. We've got these new desires and they're satisfied, and then we're thinking, well, what's next? And then just back to Cass's taxonomy. Remember, is it a good thing to prohibit knowledge? Is it possible to prohibit knowledge? Is it wise to prohibit knowledge or science? It's really, really hard, right? So say you really think it's the right thing to do, it would be a wise thing to do. How are you going to do it? Okay. Last one here. Yeah. And then I'll let you go. This arms race, like I mentioned with the gray goo and the blue goo, I think the way we do this is we don't prohibit science, at least not very much. We kind of let it rip. And then when there's unintended problems, we try to create more new knowledge to combat these problems. And that's the cycle that we're in. That's, I think, a way to describe modern society. And that is ultimately an ethical proposition about how we are going to handle knowledge and its value, right? Science and its value, and science and its place in society. Okay, I'll leave you there. Until next time, may the force be with you.